Welcome to video 2, which is about classical economics, and this is the first of 2 such recordings. Classical economics begins with Adam Smith in 1776 with the publication of his famous book, An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. Smith was a natural law philosopher, okay? Natural law is the foundation of classic liberalism, which we call conservatism in the United States, or at least did up until 1980. Natural law philosophy is an approach to understanding the world that recasts the theological religious worldview that preceded it based on the notion of God the Father overseeing human affairs in the world. The new notion was of God the Creator, who set up the world and human life to operate on the basis of natural laws. So God sort of created everything like a clock, wound it up, and then set it loose where it would be governed by natural laws rather than God interfering or acting on a day-to-day basis, as was thought in the medieval period. This was the same frame of mind of all of the Enlightenment philosophers, and most importantly, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was famous for his Principia Mathematica, which was basically the physics of mechanics published in the 1600s. And it was a very successful way of explaining phenomena in the world based on natural laws like gravity. Okay, this was done mathematically and was considered the standard for science. Smith wanted to apply this to the social world. So Smith had a notion of human nature that was given to us by God that was designed to operate society on the basis of natural law. Okay, and society itself would be governed by natural law, hence the notion, the law of supply, the law of demand, and those sorts of notions come in. So Smith is taking Newton's classical natural law language and importing it into the social world. Now, human beings have free will, right? We have the ability to make choices. We aren't like a clock. So the understanding in natural law philosophy of people like Smith was that human beings have capacities for moral reasoning, and they have the possibility of reasoning. That's what the Enlightenment was all about. So people would apply their reason to figure out, employing their many moral capacities, how they should act in a certain situation. And the goal was for individuals to use their moral capacities to bring their behavior in line with natural law, and that then would create God's good society, or a naturally good society. Now, Adam Smith did not start out to study economics. His research program was to discover which moral capacities possessed by humans were consistent with a good society. He did this by looking at each moral capacity separately and asking the question, if people acted only on this moral capacity, would a good society result? And he started with sympathy in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his first book. Now, by sympathy, Adam Smith, what we mean by empathy today, the ability of you to intellectually put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand their circumstances, and therefore understand the moral character of their pain and suffering, and thus make a judgment about your moral responsibility to help alleviate that. And he found if everybody acted on the basis of sympathy, that inevitably a good society would emerge. His next study was on self-interest, and that, of course, is the wealth of nations. Now, the strategy here was he started what he thought was the noblest of our moral capacities, sympathy, and that led to a good society. So he thought, okay, let me take our lowest moral capacity, the absolute minimum, and that is self-interest. We only care about ourselves, and see if people acted consistently on the basis of their self-interest would a good society emerge? And his answer to that in The Wealth of Nations was yes. All right. He suggested that each person operating in their own self-interest would be led as if by an invisible hand to an end that none of them intended, and that was an increase in the social welfare. And in The Wealth of Nations, that increase in social welfare was an increase in per capita income and the availability of more goods and services in society. Okay. His next book, which was never published, was on a theory of justice, and he thought people had a moral capacity for justice. And his idea was not that a society was built on a single moral capacity. He assumed that individuals had many moral capacities and they all operated simultaneously. His was an intellectual exercise, right? Economists forgot about justice, they forgot about sympathy, and they focused on self-interest as if it was the only moral capacity anyone ever acted upon. That it was natural for individuals to be self-interested and self-interested alone. That they were atomistic, separate from everyone else, no cultural connections, no social connections, utterly uninfluenced by the actions of other people. So they were atoms in society, acting in their own self-interest, utterly indifferent to the impact of their actions on anyone else. This approach is called methodological individualism, and it is thought to be the natural character of all human behavior, and this idea persists today in our concept of Homo economicus, or rational economic man. The preferences of rational economic man are fixed and constant. They're taken as given. And this is the framework, of course, of modern microeconomics that you all learned in Econ 301. Now, Smith had many contributions to classical economics because he basically founded it. He was not the first person to talk about economics. That goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But he is the first person to put together a systematic view of the economy. And by that, it was the emergent market-based economy of the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom and parts of Europe. We've already mentioned his first contribution, methodological individual and rational atomistic economic man. The second, and possibly the most important of his contributions, were his observations about the division of labor. Smith noted that in the Industrial Revolution, production processes were no longer handicraft processes where a workman went in and built the commodity all by themselves and then offered it for sale. Or the workwoman did not, make an item of clothing all by herself and then offer it for sale. That's handicraft production. We were looking at the beginnings of modern industrial production, and that involved the division of labor. You would take the production process and break it up into many, many, many individual activities, each of which were simple and could be repeated over and over and over in a very exact way. And so the worker would only have one thing they had to do, but they became very efficient at it. They became very fast at it. And the cost of producing the items dropped dramatically. The amount of them you could produce increased dramatically. And that's the beginning of mass production and low-priced goods and services being made available to the public. This leads to the third thing that Adam Smith contributed. And that is what's called the labor theory of value. This goes back to the philosopher John Locke, who argued that the basis of private property was man in the state of nature combined their effort, their human labor with the soil to make it productive in terms of agriculture, thereby owning the product of the soil, but also establishing their right to ownership of the soil as private property as a natural right. Okay? This feeds into classic liberalism too, which is about the natural rights of men, private property, and labor, owning the product of one's labor. So in Adam Smith's economics and all classical economics going forward, the source of value was labor, human labor. Capital equipment, resources, land, even money were neutral. They had no impact in creating value. All the value was created by human labor. And so goods were valuable based on the amount of human labor it took to produce them. Now, competition among firms selling the same product leads to, in markets, a market price. And that market price varies. It changes all the time based on the conditions in the market at any particular moment. But Adam Smith believed that this competition in market price would cause the market price to converge to what he called the natural price. Again, that word natural. The natural price was the true objective value of the commodity, and that price reflected the labor used to produce the commodity. So all production and all value created in market economies was created by labor, not capital, not land, not resources, and certainly not management. Labor. The next thing was that competition, by driving down the price of goods for sale in the market to their true natural price, which was based on their labor value, meant that they were for sale for the minimum price they possibly could be. Basically, what we would now call the opportunity cost of the labor necessary to produce it. Okay, which meant that the consumer was getting the best possible deal. Since goods were cheaper and they were mass produced, so they were much cheaper than they had been in the past, then per capita real income of the consumers and the producers went up. Okay, that was what he meant by an increase in the wealth of nations, an increase in per capita income in the nation. The sixth thing that is really important was Adam Smith supported free trade. Okay? Now, prior to Adam Smith, the dominant theory of trade was mercantilism, and the goal of trade was, from the perspective of the state, that they should maximize the value of exports and minimize the value of imports. This would lead to a great deal of, in this case, gold flowing into the country and very little going out of the country in terms of gold to pay for imports. So the idea was to accumulate wealth in the form of gold through international trade by using tariffs, duties, and other taxes to discourage imports and maximize exports. And this was the typical trade policy of the emerging nations of this period in time. Adam Smith and many others at this point recognized what's called the fallacy of mercantilism. The fallacy of mercantilism is, what happens if you're successful? What if you're perfectly successful? Then you fill up your country with gold, and all the goods and services you have, you sold to somebody else, right? So you have nothing to consume, but you have a big pile of gold. Gold in and of itself doesn't have any particular value except what you can buy with it. And so then you would have to use your gold to buy all your stuff back. So mercantilist was an irrational policy. Okay? And you have to keep in mind that gold was used as money because it was useless. Gold was too soft to be used in production processes, so all it could be used for is jewelry or coinage, right? So why not use it for money? It didn't have any useful value beyond that in ornamentation, which is one of the capacities that a quantity money has to have. You know, commodity money based on some thing. So he was for free trade, and the idea was if you got rid of the tariffs and duties and taxes, that would lower the cost of the goods being imported. And if the other country did the same, it would lower the cost to their consumers of their imports, your exports, thereby lowering the cost of consumers in both countries and thereby increasing their well being. So free trade benefited both countries, right? He was also for laissez faire policy, sort of. All right? When we say that, he believed that laissez faire in the market was the best policy for the market. However, he recognized that it takes a great deal of government intervention to create a market. Even in medieval times, medieval fairs required the lord in the community where the fair was taking place to provide security for the vendors so that their goods didn't get stolen, so they had to provide police protection. The lord had to serve as the justice to resolve disputes among consumers and producers and producers and producers and producers and wholesalers. All right, there's always conflicts in business, and you need a court that is an independent agent to resolve those conflicts, and the lord of the fair would have to do that. There also had to be a means of payment, a means of exchange, and that had to be guaranteed by the lord of the in that particular location as to how you paid your debts in that society. And also then that meant providing money and standards of weight and measure so that trade could take place. You have to keep in mind market exchange developed to replace the inefficiencies associated with barter. There wasn't much barter, and that's why the development of markets was necessary. And there is always government support for markets. There are government policies to support markets. In the United States today, that government intervention is much larger. The government provides roads for transportation, right? They provide right-of-ways for railroads to move goods and services. They provide all kinds of security throughout. They guarantee payment. There are all sorts of things the government has to do for you to have a market at all. So the notion of laissez-faire, free markets with no government interference, was not what Adam Smith had in mind. That is a theoretical notion which is utterly impractical in reality. The last thing about Adam Smith that's really important is his understanding of the economy is that it could not grow without end. Our notion of continuing growth into the future was completely foreign to the classical economists. Adam Smith believed that the economy would eventually reach a plateau, which he called the steady state, and that was because the limits of labor available for production in the market economy. There were only so many workers working in the market economy because these societies were largely agrarian and most people were involved in agriculture, which was not part of the market economy yet. This resulted in a notion that there was a fixed amount of revenue in the steady state available and that it had to be split between profits to sellers and wages to workers, and that there was a wage fund that was fixed because there had to be enough profits available to sellers that they could continue in business. So the wage fund was a kind of residual after the necessary, what we might call normal profits necessary for the continued operation of the market economy in terms of production. And this wage fund resulted in what's called the iron law of wages, right? You could not spend more than the wage fund on workers without impinging on the profits of producers, which were, because of competition, at the minimum already. So if you did raise workers' wages, they would slow the growth of capitalism or take it backwards away from the steady state level. Now, because you have a competitive labor market involved and there are lots of workers who might be attracted by wages, the wages always competed down to the subsistence level. All right, so workers always, because of competition in the labor market, would eventually end up at subsistence wages. This sounds terrible. It wasn't bare survival. Subsistence wages here means that they would have a wage that was just sufficient to maintain themselves and their families, because you needed to reproduce the labor force, in a situation where they were healthy enough to work and continue and to raise the next generation of workers and live at some socially acceptable minimum. Now, the socially acceptable minimum in 1776 would have been fairly low. The socially acceptable subsistence level would go up through the period of industrialization, where people expected to benefit from the higher standard of living and the increased availability of higher quality goods. All of this stuff that Adam Smith contributed sets the framework for all classical economics going forward. This version of economics is part of the philosophy of classic liberalism. This is the notion that government should be small and interfere as little as possible in the freedom of individuals to act. This is where our notions of the Bill of Rights come from, as natural, and thus we are entitled to them. And all of the freedoms we have in the Constitution are part of natural law philosophy. Even our later civil rights legislation is based on the notion that human beings have natural rights that cannot be violated. Our notion of war crimes, again, based on the notion that human beings have a natural right to live and have the opportunity, at least, to thrive in their communities. This is the foundation of our notion of freedom in a democratic society. So classic liberalism, which is going to evolve over time, is very much a principle of the foundation of our society. I know we talk about that as conservatism, but in the United States, the entire political spectrum is part of the liberal tradition. The conservative end is classic liberalism. What we call the left is modern liberalism. And the current situation since 1980 has been a hybrid sort of called neoliberalism, which has been the dominant ideology of our society in the current state of market economies. I'm going to take a break here, and then we're going to come back and talk about some other classical economists who are very important in